Trouble in the Shed, the 16th episode of the first series, and based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book Troublesome Engines, is part 2 of the Troublesome Engines saga. It carries on right where this first episode left off. At Knapford Station the next day, there is no sign of the morning train, causing the passengers to become angry. The Fat Controller was told by the station master that Henry is refusing to leave the shed, so he goes to find out what's going on. Gordon tells him that he, James and Henry will no longer fetch their own coaches or shunt inside it, declaring that shunting is for common tank engines like Thomas, not important tender engines. The Fat Controller is very surprised that the bigger engines are trying to tell him what they are willing to do and leaves for Wellsford to enlist Edwards as the station pilot to ensure that the day's trains run as normal. On the way, he notes to himself that the yard has never been the same since Thomas left for his branch line. Edward is happy to shunt the coaches, and the rest of the day's trains run as usual. The next day, however, the Fat Controller visits the yard to see how Edward is getting along, and finds that to his dismay he sees Gordon puff by and hiss loudly at Edward, who tells the Fat Controller that all the big engines hiss at him and say that he has black wheels, thinking that he is a traitor since he is a tender engine as well. The Fat Controller kindly assures Edward that he has nice blue wheels and is very proud of his work, saying that tender engines do shunt. All the same, however, he decides that they need a new tank engine to find as a permanent solution to the problem. Visiting an engine workshop, the Fat Controller looks at all kinds of engines. Soon he is shown a little green saddle tank engine and decides that this is the one he wants. The Fat Controller asks the engine if he is willing to work hard. The little engine eagerly responds that he is. With that, the matter is settled. The Fat Controller names the engine Percy and takes him back to the yard. He then asks Edward to get Percy acquainted with the yard, and the pair set off to work. Edward is very impressed by Percy's hard work and loud wheezing, something he learned in the workshop so as to be heard, which startles Henry when he attempts to insult Edward again. The Fat Controller then decides to send for Thomas and calls all the 3 engines to the yard for an announcement. He tells them that he has shut up the big engines in the shed for their little mutiny until they learn to behave, and that in their absence, the 2 tank engines and Edward will be doing their work running the railway. Edward and Thomas are put in charge of the main line, while Percy is put in charge of Thomas's branch line and looking after Annie and Clarabelle. While there are fewer trains, the passengers don't mind, as they understand that the 3 engines are doing their best to keep the railway running while the big engines are in the middle of learning a lesson. Meanwhile, in the sheds, Gordon, James and Henry are left cold, lonely and miserable. The 3 finally start to realise just how silly they have been. This was the middle story for the Troublesome Engines saga in the TV series, and it does a really good job to show the big engines' effects on what they plan to do to make sure their lives are better in the yards, since they want things back to the way they used to be, as Gordon announced in front of the Fat Controller.
We won't shunt like common tank engines. That was Thomas's job. We are important tender engines. You fetch our coaches and we will pull them. Tender engines don't shunt.
The episode marks the first appearance of Percy the Small Engine, a rather cheeky but kind engine. He normally behaves well, yet he also gets himself into trouble by jumping into situations without adequately thinking them through first. He loves teasing other engines, especially bigger ones such as Gordon and James, but is always brought down to earth in due course by anyone who gives him the moral to learn, especially the Fat Controller. He can also be somewhat timid. In this first episode, the only hint of his cheekiness is when he wishes loudly at Henry for being rude to Edward. And for the most part of this episode, we see how useful and hard-working he is. But his cheeky personality develops as the series goes on. And before the CGI series was made, this was also the only time the mainland appeared. And the engines that were in the workshop are Gordon, the Marklin engine, James, Henry and Edward, without their tenders. They already had the Marklin engine as a cameo engine to show the working life on the island of Sodor without actually showing the full engine. And it made sense for them to use the existing models since they didn't have a big budget at the time and wanted to save money. So even though it was kind of obvious from seeing their wheels, it was a good way to hide these engines so we wouldn't familiarise themselves as those characters. And one line from this episode that might raise a couple of eyebrows is this quote from Edward.
They say tender engines don't shunt, and last night they said I had black wheels.
For those of you who have no idea what the hell Edwards was talking about, this insult is a play on the word blackleg, which is a term for someone who works during a strike. In the US versions, it was changed to grey wheels, most likely to avoid confusing American audiences. Alongside Tenders and Turntables, Trouble in the Shed is another episode that I always re-watch every time I put the DVD on. It, alongside the former episode I just mentioned, are the ones that I always look forward to the most whenever I watched the VHS tape as a kid. It's another one of those episodes that I could always reincite quote to quote and reenact with my Ayrton and Wooden Railway models when I was younger. And to this day, it's still one of the most memorable and iconic episodes of the series in my opinion. And I highly recommend checking this one out if you haven't already. It's a fun episode that's a continuation to the Troublesome Engines saga, and we'll get to see the conclusion of this saga tomorrow.